Hello, hello. So, in the past several units, we've been expanding our logical system a bunch. In this unit, we're not going to. We're going to talk about a new concept, the concept of a fallacy, but we're not going to be adding new symbols or new rules or anything like that. So this is a bit of a breather unit. There's still things to learn, but not quite as intense. So that's nice. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about the fallacy of affirming the consequent. What is that? We will find out. So imagine you're in the airport and you've told Joe where the bathroom was, and he's gone off and he's wandered back, and in the meantime you've noticed this somewhat creepy guy hanging out nearby, scribbling these weird symbols, which as it turns out are logic symbols, in his notebook. And Joe returns and you're talking with him, and he drops his ticket, and you pick it up and you and Joe talk, and you realize, oh, he's won the lottery. And on hearing this, the creepy guy stands up, pulls out a gun, and says, "Give me the ticket." And this is very scary, and following thoughts go through your mind. You think, if he's a murderer, he's dangerous. He's dangerous, so he's a murderer. Or at least the thoughts go through your head in that order, and we can imagine not only that, but you actually infer the conclusion, he's a murderer, from the premises. Well, one might ask, is this argument valid? Is the reasoning valid that you just did? So what we're asking is it the case that no matter what, the conclusion is true if the premises are, that in any situation in which the premises are true, the conclusion is also true? Well, certainly the premises and conclusion could all be true, right? They could all be true, no problem. But the question we're asking is, must the conclusion be true if the premises are, when we ask whether or not the argument is valid? Well, murderers are dangerous, so the first premise is true. And this guy with a gun is certainly dangerous. But many dangerous people are not murderers. And that means that the premises can be true without the conclusion being true. Yes, he's dangerous, and yes, if he is a murderer, he's dangerous. But is he a murderer? Maybe he's dangerous for other reasons besides being a murderer. He's not actually going to intentionally fire the gun. And that means that this argument is invalid. The premises can be true, yet the conclusion can be false. It's possible for them all to be true, and the conclusion might be more likely if the premises are true, but the conclusion can also be false if the premises are true, and that means that the argument is invalid. Okay, well, in fact, this argument is an example of what we call a fallacy. A fallacy is this: it's mistaken reasoning, and more specifically, it's when you have an argument, it's invalid, but you reason as if it's valid. You take an invalid argument to be valid. And when you do that, that's a fallacy. So let's look at the specific form of this fallacy. So the reasoning looks like this. The first premise that we have is a conditional, and it's if antecedent, then consequent. The other premise is the consequent of the conditional, and the conclusion is the antecedent. And so if we were to symbolize it, it would look like this: P arrow Q, Q, therefore P. We call this fallacy affirming the consequent. It's a fallacious rule, and we label it bad/AC, right? So we have, we have MP and MT, and this we call AC, but we don't just call it AC, we call it bad AC to indicate that it's a bad inference rule. So we can compare this rule with modus ponens, which is if P then Q, P, Q. So the difference is just that the premise and the conclusion, the second premise and the conclusion are swapped, but that makes a big difference to whether or not the argument is valid. So, second example, if you live in Torrance, you live in the South Bay, you live in the South Bay. If we were following this AC rule, we would say, okay, I've got a conditional, and I've got the consequent, and I will infer the antecedent. This is clearly invalid. There are lots of places in the South Bay besides Torrance, and yet Torrance is in the South Bay. So if you live in Torrance, you do live in the South Bay. But if you live in the South Bay, you might live somewhere else. You could live in Torrance, but you might live somewhere else. And so the premises can be true, and yet the conclusion be false. And so this is another invalid argument, and it's an example of affirming the consequent, because we have a conditional. As premises, we have a conditional, and the consequent of the conditional, and the conclusion is the antecedent, and that's the affirming the consequent form. So in a fallacy, we have an invalid inference. We mistakenly think it's valid. The form bad AC is an invalid form. There are lots of inferences with this form that can have true premises and a false conclusion. We've just seen two. And it's a mistake to draw an inference because it's a bad AC inference. If you draw it, and you've made a mistake. Okay, so that's what we have to say about affirming the consequent. In the next video, I'm going to talk about some other fallacies, and then you'll have some exercises that will have some bad derivations where there's a fallacious step, and you'll need to identify where the fallacy is and which fallacy it is. And so we'll talk about that if we proceed, but so we're going to apply this knowledge by recognizing fallacies. So we'll get to more fallacies in the next video.